Okay, well, we can start with some housekeeping here as we get going. We're only a minute or two past the hour here, so this way we'll give a little bit of a soft start to people still joining. But I'm so excited to get to talk with all of you about this particular topic. It's one that I think, if you know me, you know that I've really always kind of been obsessed with what's next, what's next, what's next. And I think that's a lot of you recognize some names on here. We've had really good conversations around that. And despite a rocky year last year, there was plenty for us to be thinking about in regards to the future of work and what we're preparing for. And really, as somebody said to me, and I loved the quote, trying to never forget what we learned in this past year and applying that going forward. So excited to get to share with you guys a couple things. This is interesting. A webinar to basically myself in the window, but a lot of you out there, combines a couple of things I like. Obviously, one being the chance to get to talk with people. Two, that just the chance to get to talk. I love to talk. But unfortunately, I'm not in front of you in person. And I think some of you know this, and hopefully some of you feel this if you've not had a chance to meet me or hear me present before, that I much would rather prefer this to be in person. So if you had questions, you could throw them out. I like being interrupted. I like having conversations around what we're talking about. So I do miss that. I miss that quite a bit, actually. But I want to keep at least the spirit or the idea, if you do have questions out there. So we're going to use the chat. We switched it to, if there's a chat or a question, it'll come just to me so I can see it. I'm going to try and kind of keep that real world feel, that I'll stop and answer that in progress. But if for some reason I don't, or I miss it, we'll get to all the questions at the end and go through it. And if for some reason you have to jump off before I end and you ask a question, I'll definitely follow up with you directly. I don't want to miss any questions that comes from this. So I think we'll get started. We have people coming in here a little bit, but I do want to respect the schedule and the time. I'm so grateful that you're giving me the time. And at the start of the pandemic, it was kind of like, oh, we're getting onto a video screen. And now here at the end of I won't say the end of the pandemic, but as people are starting to open up and go back and have meetings in person, it's, oh, one more meeting in front of a screen. So I appreciate you giving me that time. I think hopefully you're going to see as we go through excitement. I have a lot of excitement and energy around these topics, mainly because I care so much about our clients and how to use them, but just in terms of networking and the business community in general, wanting to bring something of value. So what you're going to see in here, I never like to mislead or have people think that all this research was mine. It is definitely not. I think if you've read or heard from me before, I'm kind of an aggregator. I like to collect and filter and process info in a way that is consumable. And I think, is filtering for you, and maybe you haven't had a chance to get through or see some of these things, and that you either are reminded of something or learn something as we go through this. So these are things that I've found pretty interesting around how the future is going to be working and taking shape. And I hope you see that value and appreciate that as well. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. So what's interesting is, we talk about the future and we talk about, kind of what we're looking at and preparing for. But as I was doing that, there's just so many numbers and stats, and this is not, I promise, this is not a death by stats presentation, but there are just some really solid information and data that we're finding now a year past the pandemic, and things that I think really point to, why we're feeling how we're feeling. So there's these 8 big numbers that I want to share with you that I think frame up what we're going to be talking about, and they blew my mind. I don't know, maybe you've heard some of them, but I think you might find them interesting. So let's jump in. So the first one, when we think
No
about
problem.
working from home, and what we're actually going to be facing, the number of people that are going to be working from home by 2025 is projected to be 36.2 million. That's a pretty significant increase from pre-pandemic levels. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that. And yeah, we are looking a little bit further ahead than where we are right now, but that's where we're trending, and that's a fairly significant number because of what we're going to be talking about in the in the meat of the presentation here. So if you felt like your day was getting longer, it was. People are saying, I feel burned out. Well, yeah, it's getting a lot longer. 49 minutes to be exact is the average increase. That's coming from places like your commute, lunch meetings, what I call the human time around the office, getting coffee and talking to each other. And beyond the fact that it's been extended, it's how we're spending it. We're spending it working, where we don't have those personal connections, or maybe those moments of peace or stillness that we're able to find on our drive home or otherwise. So it's added to a lot of challenges in our workday and how we could potentially be burning out. So this is, we talk about helping our clients and really understanding, when we look at how we're working from home, companies have a real reason to be looking at this. And it's not, oh, everybody needs to work at home or not, but it's this idea of at least embracing the idea of a hybrid work schedule. That's a pretty big number in terms of what an employer can save by having employees work from home half the time. And that would be one thing if we were looking at it from a way to just be driving down costs. I think what we're seeing on the flip side is this challenge or this pursuit of staffing right now. And when you think about what that number can mean in terms of recruiting or bonuses or incentivizing people to either stay or come to your company, there's a lot of ways that businesses are able to use that to drive better and greater employee engagement and retention. So we've heard a lot about this, a lot of vacant office space, 4 billion square footage of vacant office space in only the 54 largest US markets. I don't know why it's not the 55 or the 50, but that's the number Forbes put out there. So it's 54. And that's a lot of space. And there's all kinds of articles being written. It's been interesting to watch, especially at the end of last year and into the start of this year, of where the storyline was going with, we'll say Manhattan. That was the one I read most recently, about the disaster, so to speak, they were looking at from space and vacancy to now as people are looking at how they're rethinking that. So it's kind of already started to come back a little bit, and I think we're going to keep seeing that. But that's a big number to think about as people are thinking about working from home. Speaking of working, this is my PSA to you, take your PTO. This number is staggering, 33% of the percentage of PTO that we left on the table last year. That's just us. And there's been so much written about this in terms of what we're seeing in the US versus companies that are international, where it always has been a priority to take that. And now we're going to actually see that come to life a little bit this year, because I don't think many people are going to leave those PTO days on the table come summer. I think we're going to see people anxious to get out, but that's a pretty big number. So a little bit of just context. Think about this. The revenue, 4.25 billion revenue loss seen in 2020 by the US dry cleaning and laundry industry. It is crazy that I used to go to the dry cleaner. We had dry cleaner pickup at our office, once a week. And now I'm lucky if I get there once a quarter. I actually found a shirt in there that I was like, oh, I haven't seen that for a couple of months. It's interesting when you think about some of these other industries that have been impacted negatively. It's just a real eye opener. 110 minutes, the average amount of time per day spent using Slack. That's up from 85 minutes. And you might think, well, doesn't seem like a lot, but that's average. And that's when we looked at, the fact that we're tethered to this more than ever. So when you think like you're working from home, you have that flexibility and freedom, you might be doing that, but then you're walking away and answering texts and responding to chats, which we're going to get into a little bit in terms of how generations do that and why it's gumming up some internal networking and communications. But that's a pretty big number to just be using on one channel. This is big as well. We talked about commutes. So yeah, we don't have that commute to relax, but wow, look at that amount of money that the average person saved. For me, it's not just in gas, but I like to stop and maybe get a cup of coffee or something for the drive home or the drive in, and I don't get, we don't do that anymore. So you think about the total amount tied to your commute, and that's a pretty big number. So so we put those in there because, yeah, I just want to say, like, I always like starting with, because I think we all realize we're going to get off this call and all go our separate ways, but we have a lot of things that are really uniting us in terms of being challenged and what we're seeing in the workplace. And I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we're all facing that a little bit. So I wanted to pull these in just to kind of show a broader number or broader picture of what we're actually dealing with here. After only 1 year into this, there are very real numbers and very real stats, but there's also very real opportunities. And this is what we call in the biz a transition slide. So one more number for you to consider, 11 numbers of letters in the word opportunity. And hopefully that's what you see here today as we go through some of the findings and some of the thoughts around the new workday. It's really staring us in the face, quite honestly. We see it all the time. We are looking at, I'll use IKEA as an example. We announced our return to work policy. We're adopting a work from anywhere come June 1. And once we started to get into that, we looked at, it wasn't necessarily the things we need to worry about. It was more about the opportunity we have to make culture events more meaningful, try to do a better job of making our communications count, really recognizing that our clients, we love spending time with them. Can we find time in our own offices to get back and just see them again? And so there's a lot of really great opportunities, I think, that are coming from this. So this is a way to kind of start to lean into those. We're going to focus on 3 for today. The first is, we talk about the future and how we're going to be working. The first is, who is the future? The second is, how are people looking at the future? How are they watching the future? How are they watching what you're doing to help them get ready for the future? And then what story are you telling as you think about how you roll that program back out, or what it means for you as you kind of return to really looking at how you balance work and prepare for the future of work? So the first one's, who is the future? And when we think about who's the future of work, who's going to be around, our offices or our screens as we look at going forward, we're looking at now connecting with anyone at any time. We talked about working from anywhere. But before we get into some of those things, I think we have to realize, there are some things that are never going to go out of style. And I think those of you that know me, I'm a PR purist. I adhere to some of the tried and true PR principles. And these are things that I think will never go out of style as we think about communicating with employees and people that are going to be getting back into the office, or how we work in their own office, however we define it. The first is, who's my audience? Am I talking to the right person? Am I talking to them in the right format? The second is, what behavior are we trying to change? Or what behavior are we trying to make them okay with changing? For us, at our company, there's some things, we developed some bad habits, and we kind of had to pull some of that off a little bit as we got ready to look at embracing this longer and full time, that we don't need to be working from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. There's ways to balance that better. What are pain points? Is it about me, or is it about them? And this really comes into communications and remembering, it's not about me, it's about what they need, it's about what their pain point may be, and helping them understand that they're heard and how we're dealing with and preparing for this. And what do they want to know from you? When you're thinking about, we could think about this a couple ways: recruiting people into your organization, communicating with your coworkers or your employees. There's a lot of things to consider, but what do they want to know from me? What, I have a little bit of time, what's the biggest thing, the best thing I can leave with them? And why we want to look at those things as mechanical and understanding how we construct our message and think about it, communications is really has become more of an art. We're communicating to so many different audiences, and that's really this first piece I want us to think about, is generational diversity that's in our office, because who we're talking to has never been more diverse and a larger group than it has been today. We have 5 active generations in the workplace, and that really creates some challenges, or maybe opportunity, when you think about how you're communicating with those audiences. So we're going to take a look at that. So for the sake of today, I know I said 5 generations, but for the sake of today, I'm going to focus on 4. And that's not to discount you know, the oldest generation in the workplace, it's to really focus on where you're going to have the greatest return in terms of how you're going to be working on your programs. And we look at those four. We have Gen Z. Yes, I know there's no 9-year-olds in the workplace. However, there are some 24-year-olds. We had passed a milestone last year where the first members of Gen Z entered the workforce. So something we want to be, you know, starting to be preparing for. Millennials. There was an article. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm getting old. I was reading about how millennials are now, the first wave of millennials are starting to turn 40, and how they're having a little bit of a career crisis. And there was a lot of pieces written on this last week. And they're actually a big reason why some companies are going to have such massive turnover, because that's a group that is really is going to walk away from their jobs going forward. So you think about communicating, that's a group we need to continue to keep focused. I know they've slipped out of the spotlight a little bit with Gen Z, but they are still very much a key generation, a key demographic. Gen X, my generation, who cares? With Gen X, we're good. We're going to do whatever. But you know, that's one that often gets overlooked, but in reality is one that I think, and I've said this a few times, I always see it as the integrator of all of the generations in the office. Probably one of the best fit to communicate, because of the, you know, the era that we were born and grew up in, and how we came into work. When I came into my first year in the job, I was faxing. Now people laugh at me when I say that. So you think about, is there a better bridge for the generational gap than Gen X and Gen Y and the Xennials? Don't worry, we're not leaving you guys out of there. The baby boomers, also a lot of focus on boomers. We're going to talk about that. You know, I could make a great case for and against communication mishaps and gaps for all of these, but baby boomers are probably one of the most critical, because while they sometimes, I think, get a bit of a bad rap, they are most open to how they should be changing their communications, and most ripe for adopting some new ways to communicate in the office. And I think that's one we need to definitely keep sight of. So how do we do that? So you know, visually, I like to communicate visually. Basically, your communication strategy, as we think about communicating with the future of work, and how we talk to people a little bit differently, has to go from you know, a unit tool, one piece, to be that Swiss Army knife. You know, how do we think about that? How do we think about our communication strategy in the terms of a Swiss Army knife? Because, as I said on that last slide, we have to think this way. And there's some organizations that have. There's people on this call that I know have. We've had conversations around it. We've helped them with that, and that's a real advantage to companies that are being a lot more present in thinking about who makes up the diversity of the workforce in terms of generational diversity. So this might look familiar to some people. We've pushed this out on the IKEA channels fairly recently, just talking about how we break down, looking at and communicating with everybody that's, you know, making up the future of our workforce. And keep in mind, you know, the reason we're doing this, the reason we're having this conversation is, yes, we want you to walk away with some tools and ideas on how you can communicate today. But we also are thinking about the future state of our workforce, the future state of our workplace. And when we do that, you know, that back to this idea of how we are communicating across these generations is even more important, because it has to be consumable and it has to be easily seen, because you're going to be recruiting in all four, you're going to be retaining in all four of these generational columns. So let's take a closer look. And this is available. We actually have a one-pager that we can share if anybody's interested in seeing this a little bit deeper. But just to kind of summarize as we go through this, I don't want this to be a presentation where I read, but I'm going to kind of hit out some of the key points here. So first generation Z, Gen Z is one I've been talking about quite a bit. Some of you heard me present on them actually. But when you think about Gen Z, you probably don't think about they are craving the in-person communication. But here's a thing to think about. They look at in-person communication as this, or as what we're doing here. They're not looking at it. Gen X, like I said earlier, I look at in-person as we're together. You know, we're talking face to face. They see it as face to face, but screen to screen. And I think that's just, I love that example, because I wanted to lead with it, because I think it immediately paints this picture of how we're trying to just shift a little nuances in how we think about this that they see in person different, but they still want that in-person communication. They still want to learn, and you're going to see that thread across all four. So think about how you're communicating with them. Yes, you want that to be an in-person driven channel, but you also want it to be easily accessible for them if they don't want to be learning in the moment or don't want to be talking in the moment. And that's why podcasts are so big. That's why TikTok is so big. That's why Spotify is so big and YouTube is so big. We're seeing YouTube is, we talked about this internally, that's the second largest search engine, largely because YouTube. I'm sure if you have Gen Z kids, my night is this. My kids get the remote and they start talking into it to bring up this video, that video. That's how they learn and that's how they communicate. They're like, Daddy, why don't you watch this video? It's like, well, how about you just tell me? No, you got to watch it. So that's how they're starting to communicate. And when you think about your communications in the company in that regard, it really starts to change the way that it's starting to take shape because it's a lot more visual than it has been in the past. Transparent, I'm not going to spend time talking about that. Transparency is going across all generations. I'll have a little bit of a note on that one, the Gen X, but that's a big factor in all four generations. Millennials, the best way to communicate with them, I learned this firsthand. It was when I kind of some informative years, or my formative years as I was moving into more of a management role. My first group that I was really managing were millennials, and it was constant text, constant messaging. That was just so familiar, so comfortable to them, communicating more on LinkedIn chat, things like that. And that's really an area that has continued to stay. You saw that Slack percentage. Well, it's not a coincidence that millennials are making up the biggest percentage of the workforce right now. So, but a note, in 5 years, it'll be Gen Z. So everything we just talked about on video and things like that, keep that in mind. So back to millennials, how they're looking to communicate. Half of them listen to podcasts. That's actually, I'll give a shout out to the millennials that were in our office at the time. They were ahead of the curve on podcasts, got me hooked on them. I'm 100% hooked on them now. And you can see, again, transparent, genuine, authentic, fast communication for them. We're going to talk about that more on the next slide, but they are looking for that instant feedback. They crave that instant feedback and response. And you got to be thinking about that in your open channels across all the audiences. Okay, so Gen X. So I could talk about that for a long time because that's me, but I think the biggest one that I would point to is that last bullet. We want informal and flexible communication. And people that work with me, I probably annoy them sometimes. It's like, just tell me what I need to know and I'll figure it out. Like, I don't want to waste your time. I want I want the guardrails. Just paint the guardrails for me and tell me kind of where you want me to stay, and I'll go figure it out. And I think that's why I said this is a good bridge generation, even though it's one of the smallest percentages in the workforce. It's a good bridge generation because we're not afraid to kind of be like, yeah, okay, I'll just go figure that out and I'll help them and I'll talk to them and we'll kind of connect the dots here. So keep that in mind, as you're communicating with that group. And so baby boomers as well, they are looking at this, from an in-person standpoint, in a traditional in-person standpoint. Still want to do phone calls, starting really to shift more to the online communication. And just like I mentioned with Gen X, wanting that informal and flexible communication, they want the formal and direct communication. That's something that I think I saw coming up in the business. I learned a lot from clients early on because there wasn't a lot of gray. There wasn't a lot in between the lines. It was very direct conversation, very direct communication, and that hasn't changed. So when you think about, so a little bit of a cheat sheet when you're talking to generations and you're thinking about how to communicate to the future of generations, the future of generations in your workplace, the soft skills are so critical. I continue to talk to the soft skills. My kids, I have 11 and a 15-year-old that I talk to at times about, not taking themselves so seriously in these soft skills. This is huge for companies right now. You think about going forward and what you're working in now, you don't have the opportunity to sit down in front of people. So you think about why that's going to be so important and how you talk to people. These are a couple I want to call your attention to. So the first is actions speak louder than words. If you say your company is doing something, or if you have something on your website, or if you roll something out internally, and we're talking about all audiences here, internal, external, but then you don't back that up with commitment, that's the obvious thing, right? That. However, flipping that and showing the commitment that you've made or are going to be making as you talk about it is a way to shortcut that. So a lot of people want to run out and get ahead of it and say, we're going to be doing all these things, and then they don't. You're starting to see companies now that are doing them, investing in them, and then rolling those out internally and saying, but don't take it from us. We're actually already doing these things. So those soft skills, knowing how to balance, that's important. Defer to the generation you're communicating with. And this is a big thing. If you're a baby boomer, don't leave a message for Gen Z. If you're a Gen Z, don't shoot a boomer at DM. Respect each other's communication channels and what their preference is. And you might say, well, that's not my problem. Well, back to those things that never go out of style, knowing your audience. It is something we have to keep in mind as a feature of how we're communicating with our employees or potential employees. Mirror the communication and to kind of play off that. If you get a DM, shoot a DM back. If you get a call, don't go back with a different level of communication. And if you do, recap it in the communication that you were originally reached out to. Understand your words are important. We mentioned in that Gen Z about in person. Your definition might not match their definition. And it's interesting to me, being in the consultative business, I think sometimes people will say, well, that I can't worry about that. Well, the companies that don't worry about that are the ones that are going to be behind the curve a little bit, in terms of how they're getting out there and communicating. Those that invest in understanding the diversity of the workforce in the future are the ones that are going to be getting ahead of the curve. And my last one, because it needs no explanation, don't use your generation as an excuse. Don't be like, well, I don't know, or I'm too old, or I don't know, that was before my time. No, we're all together in this work. We're all trying to do and point the company in the same direction. This is something that you want to invest in. Don't be the person that's using your generation as the excuse for that. I'm not going to read these again. Hopefully you had a chance to look at this, and we'll make sure we get follow up info out. But I loved this article. I pulled this from a larger HR article, and just kind of cheat sheeted it for it. I think I just turned cheat sheet into a verb, but I think I did. But just kind of listed here as a call out. So when to use, what channel, and for what. Why you might think, well, I'm just going to send an email. Well, actually, there's a way to use emails now. We're actually doing that in our own company, is starting to experiment with messaging versus emails, because when you think about it, emails they've had their time in internal communications, but do you need to send a thank you back all the time when you could be using other channels? So just something to think about, and something to, as you start to think about the future of who we're talking to. So here's what I did. I'm going to stop for a second, because when I've given this presentation in the past, we've done breakouts, and because of the timing, and because just wanted to respect this group's time, we're not doing breakouts today. But where I want to leave this is, hopefully, if you are able to take something back, it's thinking about how what we just talked about could be extended or applied to your organization. So if you're going to do that, 3 thought starters as you're doing that, or as you think about in your own organization, ways that you could apply some of this. Has anyone experienced generational communication challenges? Asking, have you heard about that in your organization? Has that come up as a blind spot? What's the biggest gap in the company's generational strategy? Thinking about auditing that. And I know there are some people on this call that have done that and would share that success story. There's real success that comes from this. And then, do you have those success stories that you could tie to understand generational communications? And I don't mean that as, pat on the back. I mean that as a case study for ways to either show to the company internally, like we're listening, this is how we've changed, or in your recruiting efforts. Because trust me, recruiting and retention, some of you already know this, that is going to be where companies live for at least the next 12 months. This is a real threat to businesses, and any advantage you can get ahead of, you're going to want to take. I had one chat, but I want to see one question. Okay, somebody wants one pager. I got you, Steph. All right, so let's get into the second. So how the future? How is the future watching your organization? So everybody wants to do video. Video killed the MarComm star for my. So I'm Gen X, because that's a song, and the first video that was on MTV. But video did kill the MarComm star. We're seeing this right now. Video. Everybody wants to engage virtually because we've had to. And B, there are some components that aren't going to go away as people look at that work from anywhere and hybrid strategy. So we want to make sure that we're not falling into traps of how we communicate and keeping that fresh and using video the right way. But there are ways that we have to look at engaging in this virtual environment, because there's some very good reasons for that. Some psychological, some cultural. So I'm gonna hit on 4 of those right now. The first is, think about this: we're smothered in gazes. I pulled that quote from an article. And somebody compared it to being the equivalent to being in a virtual equivalent of a cramped elevator. And the fact is, there was a Stanford study done, and this blew my mind, that showed that when people just log on to a Zoom call or a team call and they see the faces, they're instantly, without recognizing it, put in a fight or flight situation because the faces are staring back at them. You never would think that, but on a subconscious level is triggering this fight or flight response because of how we're being interacted with. That's a real factor, and it's shutting down channels. You don't want people you're talking to be thinking about, oh, I got to hide my face, or I got to jump up the call, or getting combative and getting up, into a different mindset for the call. So there's different ways we got to engage with people. A big one for me, I said I like being in person. I'm really big on nonverbal cues, and our verbal. On the flip side of that, our verbal volume is getting louder. So 2 things to consider here. We're frozen on a screen when we're talking or in a meeting. So I talk with my hands, but my camera's off. I can't see myself. So I've probably been doing this a ton, but that's how I like to talk. So you're seeing nonverbal. But if we're in a meeting, you're not seeing my hands. You're not seeing how I'm reacting. And that really creates a blind spot for people like us in communications that are trying and hungry to see that. Do you like what I'm saying? Do you dislike what I'm saying? Do you believe this? Can we help you? You're looking for those. And on the flip side, our verbal volume is getting louder. That same Stanford analysis showed we're talking 15% louder on video. And my wife and kids would tell you it's probably closer to 95% because they make fun of me every day for how loud I am on these calls. But you feel like you have to be because you don't have that interaction with people across the table. The psychological impact of inside the box, we all know this, we're in a box, literally. And it's really cramping creativity. If you've been in a brainstorm meeting with me, or if you're like me, I can't sit still. I have to walk around. I like to draw on the whiteboard. It just better for me. We've opened up our meeting spaces to reflect that. We don't have that anymore. We can't walk away from our computer. We're stuck here. And that's really cramping the creative style. So we have to find ways to really create more virtual engagement. And finally, this is on a deeper level, because it's one that I didn't understand all the science around it, but I understood enough to put this part in here. So according to Psychiatric Times, our brains don't release the reward hormone that comes with in-person communication. Our brain releases a chemical when we have that engagement and we see acknowledgement, or somebody's reciprocating, or just a personal conversation. Our brain's not getting that hormone. So if you feel, it's related in a brain fog, if you feel tired at the end of the day, more tired than normal, things that you wouldn't have otherwise experienced, it's because you're not getting those reward kicks or the hormonal kicks that your brain otherwise would be getting. And I don't pretend to be a scientist or understand that, but I know enough to take away from it and now in my head and say, oh yeah, I feel that way, to think we need to find a way going forward to really engage with our audiences better. So there are a couple ideas around that and to do that. So I put this in here. The most obvious, I said in a couple slides ago, boomers love the phone call. I love the phone call. I have really started to prefer jumping on a phone versus jumping on a screen, or shooting text, because I can at least hear inflection in people's voices. I can hear a pause. There's things that, okay, fine, I can't see in an in-person meeting, but I'm at least getting something that's helping me to helping me to communicate better and allowing me to connect better. But we're not just going to leave it at that. We'll go a little bit deeper on some methods, but I had to plug that because we think about our senses, and the phone call is one that I think we still have and could use. So, but the reality is we can't always do that, and the other reality is virtual is here to stay. So no matter what, and our company even looked at this, a lot of people are probably going to feel comfortable coming in for our cultural events, but we wanted to make sure people knew if they didn't, that we'd have an alternative. We're already starting to research ways that we can do that, to make people feel part of the event, not just watching on a screen and things like that. So let's talk about what some of those are. I have three. Think outside the presentation, special guest stars, and then choose your own adventure. The first is thinking outside the presentation. So, this, we're talking about the future of work, and there's ways that, we can communicate to internal audiences, but, a lot of our clients are, in the manufacturing space, for example, and have their sales teams have been, have been grounded for the better part of a year. And that, if people in sales, people in business development, that is just crippling for them. They to not be able to get out, of the house, and connect and do what they love. So, there's some ways that we can start to look around that. And one is to really, as we think outside the presentation, one is to how do we bring that to life? Well, this first one's virtual tours. Instead of telling your audience about your business, show them. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, of course, but there's a virtual tour is where I walk around with my camera. But then there's a virtual tour that brings that personality that we know and love, that sales teams and business development teams love to bring into it. Or even from our perspective, people hadn't seen our office in a while, so we recorded some footage at one of our first staff meetings when we were back in the office, and people were like, oh, I missed that space. Oh, I like that. Adding that personality into it. Or if you haven't met with somebody in a while, being able to show off your work as an example instead of walking them through a few slides. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Fight video with video. If people are tuning in, what are they seeing? We've talked with our clients a lot about video, but we're also starting to think about, beyond a traditional video. What are those vignettes? You think about, if you want somebody to take away one message, is it a 15-second video that says, remember this one thing, with the message on there? And I think people sometimes think video is us on a screen, but there's a lot of ways to use video to your advantage to break up and mix up presentations. And then a survey. I've actually started doing this quite a bit because it's so easy and people are so gracious with their time and sharing what they've learned. But just a way to create some credibility and to connect, is to look in sentiment that you are seeing, from people that you work with or peers, that you can take back and share out, whether it's on a sales call. And I keep using that as an example, but it is a real example because that's a real challenge facing companies, is making that personal connection. But also internal. Think about, you have a huge audience internal that you can lean on and trust to get information about the workforce or about the culture. And especially when you're trying to learn with people that you work with, to share that back out. So those are things that you could be doing that, I think are pretty straightforward, that change the presentation a little bit. Special guest stars. The Zoom bomb has gotten quite a bit of attention over the past year, but how about good ones? I know a lot of you guys are big on, connecting with SMEs in your space, or, really profiling the folks in your own business that are considered influencers. But, can you have them Zoom bomb a call? And, let's not wait to talk to that person. Let's bring them in right now to answer this one question. And I know that sounds like, well, yeah, it's pretty straightforward, but just anything we can be doing to break up these presentations and bringing a little bit of personality and flavor to, these virtual environments, is something that will pay off, significantly as people are remembering what you talked about. Don't take our word for it. Testimonials are huge. I think that there's ways that you can tailor a testimonial specifically to who you're talking to. If you think about, it's one-on-one, can you have somebody record, say, hey, you're going to be talking to Ben, and ask him about this one thing. He helped me with this one thing. Just something that personalizes it and opens up a conversation, gives you a chance to stop talking and breathe, and let them hear from somebody else. Same thing, a little bit of a different angle, with this next one is, can you do the same thing with senior management or senior leaders? We've gotten the privilege of getting to work with, folks in the C-suite over the last year more than maybe ever, because they see the value in communications and tailoring this communication. So they want to connect with, customers and prospects and employees more than ever, and are lending their time to this. A quick video that's tailored to just that company or just that prospect, showing appreciation or interest. Or on the flip side, to employees, think about, I always steal ideas from my kids' schools. We get right now, their principals are doing their principal awards. So instead of getting a piece of paper and a picture in the newsletter, For virtual students, the principals are calling the parents and leaving messages. And that goes a long way with the student, of course, because they feel disconnected. Think about that from your employee standpoint. Is there a way to bring the leadership into that, to break up a presentation or to connect them a little bit better? These are things we have to keep in mind as we think about attracting the talent for our future organizations. Okay, so our last one is choose your own adventure. This is a big one. I like this one. Again, I'm a child of the 80s and I read those books where, you could choose what adventure you wanted to take. But I think that we have to think this way a little bit with presentations and communications as we're presenting to customers or even internally. Hey, if you choose to do this, this is what you should consider. From an employee standpoint, we're doing that anyway with our work from anywhere policies or our remote work policies. If I choose door number one, what's in it for me? And it's okay to do that on an interactive level. This first one here, you can build presentations this way that, it might take a little bit more time, but you could go 3 different ways based on when you hit a certain point. If a customer or potential customer wants to go this way, that's going to feel a little bit more tailored and put them in the driver's seat a little bit more than they would just getting presented to. Remember, being smothered with gazes and things on the other end of the screen versus participating and engaging. Feel the pain. I talked about pain points. It's never going out of style, and it's not. But how do we adapt that to our future audiences? Can we work through an assessment for a potential customer or a customer, audit what they've been doing, and present that to them? Bring something of value on the call to show, like, hey, we did some quick research and found this. Thought you might be interested. We talked to folks in the industry, and these are the top 3 things they're stressed about. Do any of them sound familiar to you? These are things we can be bringing into it that customize and just create a lot more, that make them a little bit more memorable and create a little bit more sticking power as you're going through, your takeaways. And then finally, customize the experience. I think of a movie trailer. Teaser trailers are big, 15-second teaser trailers. Can you send a 15-second video and say, hey, can't wait to talk to you. We're talking about these 3 things. Or, flash something across the screen that's from your presentation. Just something to get them a little bit more engaged as they get ready for that presentation, so they feel, or for that meeting, so they feel this is going to be a little bit different than what I was expecting. And internal comms can be the same way. There are a lot of great examples, bringing in sound bites from employees, or what they hope to learn or what they hope to share, just to create a little bit more differentiation from the standard presentation and what we've been experiencing. So this, I mentioned those things that don't go out of style, and I think from our PR friends on the call, this is one we grew up with. We have to prove that what we're doing is working. But I think in the fast-paced environment that we're facing today, it's easy to not do these. The post-meeting surveys, the postmortems, right? So what did we learn? And I think sometimes people are a little afraid to dip a toe in this because of the feedback they could get. But I'm pretty willing to bet if you're on this call, it's because you want to get better, and we all want to get better and prepare. So this is the best way to do it. Can we just ask, hey, how'd it go? And there's some big takeaways with that. The first, your shortened cycle time. Let's make sure that the next time we do this, whether it's recruiting or a sales presentation, that we are doing it a little bit better. People have the chance to feel heard. They want to feel heard. Oh, thanks for asking. Actually, now that you mentioned it, this type of thing. Faster feedback, getting them used to it. Eventually, they might not even need to wait to be asked. They might shoot you a note. It deepens trust. I think even internally, when somebody says, hey, what could I be doing better? Or what did you think of that? I'm like, oh, wow, you actually care what I think? Yeah, let me tell you. There's just that trust and that personal connection that I think is easy to gain, but quickly lost if we don't take advantage of this. And the last one is where I started. You'll get better. I'll get better. That's I'm want to make sure that what we're presenting and how we present is always a value. So I'm always wanting to hear feedback, and I think that's the main driver and why we do something like this. So 3 breakout questions here for your organization is, what are you hearing from your audiences? Have you, like we just on the last slide, have you stopped to ask that? Have you stopped to consider that? The second is, if you shift that thinking from technology to different, what other ideas can come from that? And here's what I mean by that. When we think of, we're talking technology, I think everybody thinks of greater virtual engagement as the new Zoom, the next Teams, technical videos, things like that. I'm actually talking about just different in general where there's no wrong answer. So if you think about, let's just get a crazy idea up there. Let's just get a different idea up there. And some things that you might have never considered doing that you might end up doing. Would it help your presentation stand out? Would it help you be heard? That's really what you want to be measuring yourself against. And then when you are looking at this, we don't want to lose this because we're talking about the future. What impact does the future of virtual and hybrid have on the newer generation of customers or employees? When you think about how you present your organization, it used to be you better have all your stuff on your website. Then it was you better have communication on your social channels. Then it was your search terms better match so you can. Now it's what are the other channels? What are the ways potential employees, customers, potential customers want to engage? Have I thought of all of them? Are they all readily available and are they inclusive for me to find? And when you start to think about that, there's always room for improvement. You're not going to do it all at once, but getting to it and then prioritizing is some of the ways that you can bring that value back to the organization. And really what I wanted to part with or to leave with you on this. So our last one, it's the shortest of the three. But when we think about the future, and so think about where we've gone. So we've talked about who we're talking to, covered how we're talking to them. But this third piece, and some might recognize this because it's from a larger presentation I do on personal branding that I have a soft spot for personal branding. It's I have an emotional tie to it. I have a passionate tie to it because I am in this business because I love meeting people and love hearing their stories. And I have been deprived of that over the last year and that connection of getting to talk to people and see people. And it's where I personally realized over the last year where I get my energy and inspiration from. And you guys might be experiencing the same thing. But that story and the stories that people have are just so valuable in this organization or in this industry and to your organization. And when you think about what story you're telling, I think we can get wrapped up in the quickest way and the best way and how we get out there. But if we don't have that story locked in, we're losing a real opportunity to connect with people on a level that they're hungry for, especially now. So regardless of where your company is, regardless of where their brand is and their story, regardless of where your personal brand is, it's so important to have putting this thought into your story because we have to start to live this by example. So you think about you being on the call and what you could be taking back to your organizations or to your audiences. How's your personal brand? Let's think about that for a second. How's your personal brand? What shape is it in? Do you feel good about it? Have you reviewed it lately? And here's why. We look at this phrase during these uncertain times, I'm retiring. I don't think anybody would have a problem with me retiring that. However, it has created a new space for us to work and live in. And that's the fact that companies are placing trust in partners more than ever. That could be supply chain, that could be recruiting partners, that could be a partner like us. You get the idea. But they need them. They realize they need them more than ever for a lot of different reasons. And when you think about that, was the pandemic the reason for that or the excuse for that? And I think what people have been finding is it's something they knew they needed for a while. They knew they needed to go through this and audit this and have this story locked in. But there were other things that got in the way and it wasn't a necessity. Now it's a necessity. We've seen that. And that's this next point. This shift has happened and it's working. This stat is huge. 91% of brand marketers are staying committed to trust building strategies that they established in 2020 and 2021. And when you think about trust building strategies, I won't spend time going through all the examples or potential tactics for that, but things that show you have a connection and show what people, the story that people are taking away from you, why they do business with you, those types of things. Empathy, for one, is something that's really driving and connecting growth for people, whether it's bringing employees in, keeping them, bringing customers in. That's the next point. Obviously set that up. Empathy is greater than sales right now. We don't have the opportunity. Obviously, business goals, we want sales, of course, but empathy and how we focus that personal factor of who we are as a person and as an organization is really starting to take precedent. This stat shows it. In that same survey, more companies are claiming the approach would be empathy driven versus sales driven. It's only a little notch above sales driven, But when you think about that, that's just the fact it's above it or even close to it is a big shift of where we were pre-pandemic. And the final piece, the pandemic, we don't want to talk about it, but we have to talk about it. It has become the great equalizer. I don't know if you're a large company, small company, 1 person, 5 person. Doesn't matter if you have that really cool club membership or that's really great seats to the Indians game or to wherever. Because nobody was going anywhere. And all of a sudden, everything became on a level playing field, and we forced us to use skills, some of us that we're really good at, some of us that we had to learn, but to put all those back on the table. And that is that we talked about empathy, but that human approach, connecting on a human level. And that's why the story aspect of this is so important. So personal brand, never mattered more. Company brand, obviously, how does the company embody those personal values or traits that make people connect and they recognize with themselves? Welcome to the only time you will ever see my name, well, I guess not my name even, me on the same slide with Jeff Bezos, but he made a famous quote that I used to love. Personal brand is what people say about you when you leave the room. Well, we're not leaving rooms anymore. And when you think about what personal brand is, it's what they say about you before you enter the room. And that's making sure, and I have a process for this, and it's a much larger presentation, but I want to walk you through at least a little bit of that so you can understand why it's so important to kind of think through that on a personal level. So I say this, it's the most important, and that's why I say it. It is important because you have to look at this from that personal sense, or otherwise the other pieces of what you do will feel shallow. And going all the way back to our generational gap, there's that transparency, there's that authenticity. There are those things that people are looking at to really connect with. They have to feel that. So what does that mean, and why does it matter? Well, first things first, it comes down to self-evaluation. Are you just going through the motions? Are you just going through the motions in terms of, oh, well, I stand for this. Well, do you or do you? And how do you live that? Do you know your story? Have you asked yourself, what's my personal motivation? Why do I get up? What gets me up for this business? What gets me up for my employees, my staff, my customers? That's a hard question to answer. I've done it recently. And when you actually start to dig into it, you get into an uncomfortable space, I'll say, because you really start to look at things from a different aspect of, okay, if I believe these things, am I living these things? Going forward, and we're talking about the future state, going forward, people are going to be expecting that, not because of what we're doing right now, or not because of what we're doing down the road, but because of what we're doing right now. The way we're starting to communicate with people, that's going to stick, and that's going to become table stakes versus, boy, I'll get to that when I have a chance to. What's your competitive advantage and differentiator? The best part of this is that, do you believe it? Do you believe that's really your differentiator? A lot of people can spit it out and have memorized it, but is that it? When you come to a branding exercise, you lead folks through that question. It's one of the first questions you ask. And when you get them one-on-one, you hear it in their voice, those nonverbal cues we're talking about in person or on a phone. When you hear it, you don't know if they believe it, and that's okay, but that's something you have to come to grips with. Are you putting yourself in the story? Are you an observer, or are you a fanatic of your story? Do you just tell it in passing? Is it like, well, I stand for this, or my company does this, I think they do this, and they like this? Or are you part of it? Now you have to be part of it. You have to feel it. You have to believe it. And when you finally get to this last point here, does your story align with your company's story? And you might not think that matters because people need a job and people need jobs, and yes, they do. But when you look at the huge turnover that's coming, and when you look at the shift in the fight for talent that has changed completely from the fight for talent from 2 years ago, you want people to feel and understand your story so they have something to connect to. And when you think about you and you answer these questions, if it does align, great. If it doesn't, fine, there's work to do. But if it doesn't, that's where the problems are. And our executive vice president wrote a blog recently. April Wanzik, she talked about these three key factors to keep in mind for storytelling. You're probably not going to be surprised by this, as we just talked about the factors that are important to consider. Authenticity, relatability, and consistency all roll through all those things we just talked about. And as I said before, in other words, just be human. The good news is, as we get, as we come up to the hour, the good news is, and where we want to leave this, we have a process for this. And this is not me saying engage a Kia for it. It's saying there are processes out there, whether it's ours, somebody else's, however you look at it. Ours, this is ours because it's one I'm familiar with, but this is something that you really have to consider as you think about connecting yourself to your company to your audiences, and being ready for that future state of work. So these 5 here are pretty straightforward. You defined, we kind of previewed that on the last slide. What do you stand for? And that could be company based, but also you based. What's your mission? What's your vision? What are your values? To answer that previous question, and do they align? What people can find out about you. Have you done your own personal audit of what's out there on your channels and what comes up when you search for yourself, and how you're using your channels and what's working and what's not? What do people know about you? Results based. And that is that word of mouth, that reputation marketing, right? If you say, what's Ben about? And I say, call these 3 people. And if they can tell you, do your own research with people you see I'm connected with or clients on our website, and they can't tell you, that's my fault. I haven't done a good job of that. I need to put my results out there and make sure that people understand I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. And that's a connection that we want to have. And then finally, the one that I learned from our founder, and I think is maybe the most important, is how do you make people feel? What experience do you leave them with at the end of the day from a branding standpoint? So breakout questions, as you consider to take those back to your organization. Do you have a personal purpose? If yes, how does that come to life in the day-to-day? Have your audiences shifted what they value? Yes, they have in the last year, but what do those look like? How do you make that connection? And do you feel your company has evolved to embrace that empathy that we talked about? Is the human connection missing? Those are hard questions to answer. They go back to the soft skills, but they are critical to answer and put your organization under the microscope as you think about preparing for the future state of work. So as we wrap up, I don't think you need me to connect the dot for you. The power sits with you. I hope that you were able to take some of that away and see what you could do to impact your organization. Happy to talk more about that with any of you at any time. Here's all my info, and I'll leave it up here for a second. As we look at, I want to make sure that I didn't skip any questions. Whoops. I didn't skip any questions. Alethea, if Alethea is still on the call, if not, I can get back to her. How do other generational and cultural differences impact communications and channels, like identity, gender, ethnic, racial, etc., attitudes towards gender identity and sexual orientation in particular vary greatly among today's workforce? That's one I'll need more time to get into because it's such an important question. But this is, if there's a part 2 of that slide that I put up there, it's going to be around this. And I think as companies start, I don't think it's fair to put generational diversity here on its own and not integrate it with cultural diversity and all the things that she just referenced, because I think that is a key differentiator going forward. And you think about generational attitudes, are there bias, or is there different ways that people are thinking in the generation? Yeah, a little bit, but it is something that we need to be aware of across all generations. And it's one that I think is going to be just as important, and one that I definitely want to dig into more, as we actually are right now, because we're helping clients with that, as you would expect. But it is something that I think companies need to take into account when they're looking at that full diversity and full generational diversity. So, and I'll actually follow up on an email to that with a little bit more specifics. But in the interest of time, if there are any other questions, you can send them to me directly. You can email me or follow up with me on any of these channels here. But I just want to thank you guys. We're right up against 2. I wanted to thank you guys for giving me the hour. Hopefully you were able to take a few things away, and definitely appreciate the chance to get to talk with you and share with you. So thank you very much.